Hello there, this is Sohail Hasnie, your host at Energypreneurs. Cheap solar power, batteries, and electric vehicles are changing the transport and energy sector as we know. I bring in guests to this podcast who will help you with their ideas to navigate this energy transition. Thank you for joining. Good morning, Joy.
Good morning.
I'm very honored to have you on my podcast. You are one of the global leader on one of the topic that's lithium. Maybe you introduce yourself first and we see what we can learn from you today.
I've been in the industry for 35 years before most people knew how to spell lithium. It's been a long journey. I was fortunate to join one of the two lithium companies in the Western world at the time. And that's how small lithium was. I worked for FMC Lithium. I was very lucky to be at the right place at the right time and had the good fortune to be the person who brought lithium to the lithium ion battery space first. I was traveling to Japan so often that my employer asked me to move my family there. And I did that in the year 2000, lived in Asia for 11 years. And because of that good fortune, I spent a lot of time. I was 5.5 years in Japan, 5.5 years in China. I traveled to both countries often when I was living in the other one and watched the whole thing grow and develop, met all the players. So I just had a good fortune to be at the right place at the right time. Later on, I was the first supplier to Nissan when they brought out the Nissan Leaf, and Tesla when they brought out their first piece, the Roadster and then the Model S. It's been a long road. The last 13 years, I've been an advisor to various companies around the world, including the likes of CATL. I was doing business with BYD 25 years ago. I was selling them lithium carbonate and cathode materials. It's been a long journey, and now it's increasingly interesting because people know what lithium is now.
Yes, the first thing on the periodic table. So when you say the right time, why 2000 was the right time for lithium?
Now, it was the right time for me to move to Asia. Japan was growing rapidly back in the early days. The US was still using nickel metal hydride batteries in cell phones. And the Japanese were buying new cell phones every 6 months. And the industry was growing very fast. And the company I worked for had a partnership for a long time with two Japanese companies. They had a lock the business. So it was fortunate for me because from that platform, I became the gaijin who supplied everybody. When I went to China, I was the Lowry who had lithium. It really couldn't have been a better time to go. I watched the nascent industry mature because if you go back to 2000, it was all Japan. Then the Koreans got involved and started making batteries. Later on, China made a strategic decision to electrify their automobile business. BYD bought a state-owned car company in the early 2000s. I thought it would bankrupt them, honestly, but obviously that was the wrong conclusion. BYD is now the largest EV manufacturer on the planet. Watching China grow was astounding. And it's very interesting that Japan and China are both Confucian cultures, but business culture is much different. Everybody in China wanted to be an entrepreneur, which the West didn't really understand. More entrepreneurs in China than anywhere. And if you look around Asia, a lot of the Thai entrepreneurs have Chinese DNA. So it's a very common theme.
Yeah, China is quite amazing. I was working on Chinese project between 2000 and 2004. One thing that they want to move fast. The Chinese colleagues, the senior government of China, very good at seeing value. You propose something, innovation, they are very good at watching value. Where with BYD 25 years ago, of course, nobody knew. Of course, lithium didn't knew. So what sort of vision you had at that time, or you were just supporting, excited about the material?
It was an interesting thing because Japan dominated the lithium ion space because they were the
Mhm.
first mover. I was seeing the other side of it. I was seeing China develop quickly. There were companies trying to make batteries, trying to make cathode. It took them quite a long time. And that's what people don't understand was China really committed
Mhm.
because for the first 10 to 15 years of the lithium ion battery industry, it was Japan first, then Korea.
Mhm.
And Japan and Korea would not buy Chinese made materials because they simply weren't world class quality. What they missed was that China kept doubling down on investment and kept moving forward. By 2002, I was going to China once a month. I would see the progress. I would come back and say to my Japanese partners and customers that you better pay attention to China. And they would just wave me off. And I said, you may wave me off now, but ultimately you're going to pay the price. And that's exactly what happened. This year, Japan, which was the dominant player, will have less than 5% of the lithium ion battery market. BYD and CATL have over 50%.
They
Just those two companies.
Yeah, they literally have taken over the world with the battery
That's correct.
cars. You must have a very strong view about Nissan Leaf and what it could have done because I remember I got excited about the electric car. I knew about the Tesla Roadster happening, but Nissan Leaf really got excited. And I was in Japan and went to one of the factories. Wow, this is the future. This is what's happening. Of course, that's 10 years down the track from where you started. So Nissan Leaf
Yeah.
could have been a big thing.
Unfortunately, if you go back to Carlos Ghosn was running Nissan at the time, and he made a lot of promises, and that car just did not deliver. I drove a Leaf the first time, rented it at Osaka train station to drive to a customer in Kobe on a very cold February day and almost couldn't make it back. If you know anything about Japan, Kobe is not very far from Osaka. And it was clear then that he's just had to get better because Japan didn't even really embrace the Leaf. The Leaf was a troubled vehicle from the beginning because it was just too limited a range. People that I knew in America that bought them. I had an example where a friend of mine in Denver had a Leaf and he wanted to take me out to dinner, but he said, I'm going to have to get my wife's car because I literally can't pick you up, go to the restaurant and get back without recharging. That's how limited the Leaf was. The first step of any journey is hard. The irony was, I think the Leaf was 2008. I went to the 2010 Shanghai Auto Show, and literally none of the Chinese EVs had batteries in them. They were all concept cars. I started to pound down the side where the battery should be, and it was clearly hollow. They asked me to stop doing that. By 2014, China had some reasonable products. And that was the mistake the West made, is not seeing how committed and how fast China's quality was improving and the steps they were making. So that's been true in many industries. But I think the lithium ion battery space is probably, from a technology perspective, China's greatest success, depending on what ultimately happens with DeepSeek.
At that time, you must also remember Shai Agassi's company, Better Place. I
Yeah.
remember that inspirational YouTube video I saw of him. And of course, the battery swapping was challenging because at that time I saw in Tokyo, they were telling this each battery swapping place cost $1 million and you have to wait and you have to keep all those very expensive batteries as an inventory for the next to come in. So, what's your view on that one? They were doing
Well, he was
great.
just ahead of his time. And that's happened to a lot of people that had a great idea that was 10 or 15 or even 20 years too early. Look at what is happening now with battery swapping. It's becoming viable. But at that time, it got a lot of press, even in the United States. From the perspective of the American consumer, it was like, okay, it's easier than recharging conceptually, but he was early. And sometimes the guys who are early go bankrupt.
You mentioned the mobile phone triggered the battery industry. Of course, that was the immediate use. Now there's a lot of hope that electric vehicle will go even faster. And now the jury is out. Some people, of course, the fossil fuel car industries and fossil fuel industries always want to inflate the bad news that EVs are not selling, but EVs are selling, especially BYD is taking over the world. What's your view of the future? I personally think the next big thing will be home batteries. You might have a 45 kilowatt hour, 60 kilowatt hour battery in your car. You might have two cars, but home can easily have 100. And that can really, and of course, on grid large batteries. What's your view? Are we going to see lithium changing dramatically in the coming years?
I made a presentation in 2010 to the company I worked for at the Times Management. And I said, I believe that by 2025, energy storage for renewables, for the grid, for wind, for solar would be as big or bigger than EV. I had the right idea. My timing was a little off, but I believe that will ultimately happen. You see the need for energy for AI. You have a lot of things going, but I don't view EVs right now are dominant as far as lithium demand goes, but energy storage is growing at a faster rate. And then you layer in, and I get people that ask me about this all the time, drones. Robots are supposed to be a huge thing by 2030. So the whole concept of the battery is much bigger than electric vehicles. In the West, the United States, and even the EU, they've said, oh, it's not growing as fast as we thought. Nobody wants an EV, which isn't really true. EVs are still growing globally faster than anybody thought because of BYD. China right now is kind of like the US was in the early 1900s. We had hundreds of car companies that wound up becoming the big three. I think you'll see a similar situation in China. I don't think it'll be down to three, but I think the hundreds of EV makers will wind up being less than 10. China knows how to manage their economy quite well. And they know how to use incentives, I would say, much better than the West does, at least in the last 25 years. I think if we looked out to 2035, 2040, he still may be the largest demand, but energy storage is very close. And there's a lot of other battery demands that we're not even sure of how big they're going to be.
Electric vehicle is not just a four-wheelers. There is a three-wheelers, there's a whole two-wheelers. And then you mentioned drones, and then electric planes for short distance flights become suddenly viable. So I think there's no end to it. If we could store energy, God knows where else we will store and what else we'll put.
Yeah. And the big question that I'm often asked is, will something come along and replace lithium ion? And certainly that'll happen, but it will still probably use lithium because unless the periodic table changes, whether it's solid state or some other form, more than likely lithium is still going to be the dominant battery material when you and I are both gone.
Yeah, exactly as you mentioned. Unless there's a new periodic table or you have a helium battery, lithium is the lightest, right?
And even all those pundits that said hydrogen will be the dominant form for transportation. Well, how's that going?
It never made sense because hydrogen car is an electric car. And if you are going to store, why you have to convert into something else, which is highly flammable, dangerous, and or God knows what else, and then put it back and run. The fuel cell cars never took off. You must have a view on Toyota Mirai, no?
Yeah, as great a company as Toyota's been, and I actually still drive a Lexus, Toyota just continues to call this market wrong. They got a lot of credit last year in the US because hybrids got very popular. But what Americans don't really understand is that when you look at the global car market, we're just not as important as we used to be. Toyota has gone back and forth for different technologies. And they've called the market wrong more than they've called it right in the last 10 years. I don't think Toyota is really the company to be watching now. I think they're going to be in a position of just trying to play catch up.
Yeah, but I think Japan's case may be different. One of the senior official in the Japanese government once told me Toyota is almost representative of Japan, and everybody has a family member works for Toyota making air conditioner, and Toyota goes electric. What are these people going to do? So it's very difficult for Toyota to let go of their incumbent status because that's a whole community behind it. So they wanted to be the Kodaks of the world, saying, let's see, slow space. And as you correctly said, future is not that bright.
When you juxtapose the two cultures, Japan and China, having lived in both, the one thing I love about Japan is the history and the culture, and things tend not to change. But there's a plus and a minus to that. It used to be when I would go on a 3-week trip, I could come back and a bridge would be gone. And then 6 weeks later, there'd be a bridge built or a building. Or look at China put in 17,000 kilometers of high-speed rail in less than a decade. I was living there when the first several thousand kilometers were built, and it was every bit as good. And I was a weekly traveler on the Shinkansen between Osaka and Tokyo. I was shocked when I rode my first long ride on a bullet train in China from Shanghai. The biggest difference was there was still so much pollution in China that for most of that ride, you couldn't see more than 300 meters left or right. But the train worked every bit as well as the Japanese train.
Yes, and they are continuously improving.
Yeah, that's an absolute fact. And that's something I think is hard for some of the competitors to accept. When I lived in China, it was mostly ICEs, and Volkswagen and GM taught China how to have a car industry. And now both companies are suffering from the fact that they didn't make the transition to electric very well. And now it's out of their hands.
Yes, and all over Asia, you go around, even in Australia, we have so many BYDs. I think right now we have maybe one of the largest collection of new generation Chinese car entering Australian market.
It's all over the world now, except for the United States, actually. But we'll see. I honestly believe the U.S. should take a chapter from China's book and should welcome CATL here for battery, welcome BYD here for EVs. And that's not a hugely popular position, although I think Trump may surprise a lot of people because he wants to make deals. And that may be one of the smartest deals he could make.
Because NIO is not doing extremely well. NIO is struggling. Their car is very advanced. And I think Xiaomi is very popular in China, Xiaomi cars.
Yeah, I've got a good friend that has a company that follows the China EV industry closely. I've had him on my podcast a couple of times, and he still spends a lot of time in China and getting the latest. But he grew up in Detroit. His family worked for GM. It's interesting to hear his perspective. But anybody that really follows it closely just says China is handing not just the U.S. automakers, the Mercedes, the BMWs, the Europeans as well.
Yeah. So what's your vision and views on when you take the AI, which is driving super fast on the car and autonomous vehicle, and those thinking, do we need that many cars, or really autonomous car will change the world the way a lot of discussions were in the past?
It's too early to really predict the numbers. I took my first autonomous car ride in Phoenix, Arizona last June, and was a completely positive experience. It was odd. It's strange to be in a car with no driver, but I can see that taking a huge chunk out of the number of cars necessary. But then there's the cultural aspect. I think in some countries, and I think I live in one of them, people aren't ready for that yet. It'll be a thing where it takes time. I don't think that will quickly be adopted here, but we'll see how the impact is in China on autonomous. Love the Tesla full self-driving, trust it. It probably maybe more than they should. But yeah, it's definitely going to happen. Whether that takes the car market down by 30% or 40%, I don't know.
No, because
Ultimately, it will have a huge impact. It's just
yeah,
how long it takes.
I also add to that fact that the aging population. I remember when I first saw my dad saying, okay, this is the last day I'm driving no longer, and I could not relate to the man without driving. I always worried I will not qualify for driving. But now, as people living longer, so I think there will be another segment coming in. Yes, there may not be enough people to drive you around, even if you could afford it. That might also drive a whole set of public transport replacement in a way, autonomous car driving around.
The other aspect of that is if you have a car that's in service 18 hours a day, battery demand lessening isn't linear because those cars are going to have their batteries replaced much more often than a private fleet. In my working life, most of the years was working, when I traveled, I rented a car every time I landed in another city. I don't rent cars anymore. Unless I have to drive 100 miles from where I land. If I'm in the metro area, I just take an Uber. That transition happened pretty quickly. The first time I took an Uber was the day my daughter graduated from college. And she goes, Dad, we ought to just go to the restaurant in an Uber, not your rental car. And I literally stood there, and this is 2013, downloaded the app, put my credit card info in, and I've been an Uber guy ever since.
It changed everything. Even the city you live in, you go to the central business district for a dinner or a place which is a lot of traffic, you opt to take a ride sharing thing. It's much easier. You don't have to think about parking.
Yeah. So I do think from that perspective, maybe things change faster than I thought, because in that example, that's just so common. Most of my nieces and nephews, and I have a lot of them, my kids, it's DoorDash, it's Uber Eats, it's what's easy and what's on an app.
So when you are not thinking batteries or lithium, what else you do for fun?
Yeah, I'm the odd American. I live in the South, but I go north in the winter. I don't go to warmer weather. I go to colder weather. I grew up skiing. I grew up near the Canadian border. So I do a lot of skiing. I hike, play golf. I do a lot of physical things, even at my advanced age. And yeah, those kind of things. And writing a book, you got to stay active.
So tell me about your book. What are you writing or working on?
I am writing a book about my career in lithium. It's, in a sense, I think I have a built-in audience because of my podcast. My podcast has been downloaded in every country on earth except for Bhutan. That is so unimaginable to me because of lithium being such a niche thing. And the fact that I go to conferences. Last week, I was in a conference in Florida, and a young man from Nigeria walked up to me and told me how my podcast was how he learned about lithium. Now he works for a lithium company. I've had that story many, many times. And I just think it's hard for people to imagine that when I started, and I said I worked in lithium, unless somebody had a manic depressive relative that was taking lithium, they had no idea what I was talking about, because I started working in lithium before the lithium ion battery existed. Now, literally everybody you come into contact with has lithium in their pocket. And it doesn't matter where you are. You can be in the third world. There aren't that many people on the planet that don't have some form of cell phone.
I like that. Everyone has a lithium in a pocket. That could be a book title, no? That's
Yeah.
pretty
Well,
good.
my title's Lithium Confidential, but I have a lot of stories because I knew the first Chinese lithium billionaires when they didn't have anything, when they were dirt poor and had worked for state-owned enterprises and had the vision to get into lithium as their career. Now, some of those guys are worth 5, 6, $7 billion. And seeing that happen is quite interesting.
Now that you have seen that, one of our listeners thinking, okay, how do I get into this space or what I should do? Is it too late? What do you tell the entrepreneurs slash engineers who are trying to get into this space?
I think it's really about determination and grit. Most people at the end have ideas, but they'll take an easy path. But what I've seen is that if somebody's committed to get into a sector, there's a way. They might have to start in a position they don't really want. I'm a great example of that. I ran the finance department in the lithium company I worked for. And I immediately had said when I entered, I worked in the oil industry my first 5 years after grad school, and I wanted to get into a commercial role. The HR director said, "You have no chance. You have to be a chemical engineer." And as luck would have it, we had a change in management. I made a pitch. I said, the problem with the guys selling lithium that are chemical engineers is they fall in love with the chemistry and they don't understand the economics. I went at it from a value perspective of you're really selling economic value when you're selling lithium. And this was not to the battery industry. This was to aluminum, grease, glass. To make up for my technical failings, I hired some of the top R&D people from my customers. As somebody would be at retirement age, I hired the ex-head of R&D at Reynolds Metals to help me with aluminum. I hired the chief geologist at Corning Glass to help me sell to the glass industry. So there's always a way. You just have to be creative. But if I had just said, HR told me I couldn't have the job, so I better go back to bean counting, we wouldn't be talking today.
I like that. So people have to have a good grit and continue and never give up, because the opportunities will keep on growing, because lithium is not going to stop. I'm also a believer like you, because it's the lightest material. I've interviewed a lot of people. I know a lot of people on the lithium battery trends. Nothing coming online that is credible enough and light enough that can take over this space.
I believe that. I think that what I don't agree with is when people make it almost a religious thing, and oil's not disappearing either. And I worked for an oil company for a long time, and now I advise some oil companies that are trying to get into lithium. So I don't see the guys in fossil fuel as the enemy. Actually, I see them as part of the solution, because one of the biggest problems lithium's had is it had been junior miners that were always the people trying to enter, and they didn't have the capital to get things done. The big oil companies can do whatever they want. A big oil company right now could still buy the entire lithium industry.
Because if you take Rio Tintos of the world, I can see what you're saying.
Rio Tinto just got in. When I started, I was never free to speak at events or write or have a podcast when I worked for a lithium company. When I started advising lithium companies, I was free to do whatever I wanted to. It's the way I structured my agreements. And what I've said for the last 10 years is we needed the big oil companies to get in. But if the lithium industry was so small, the total market for lithium chemicals didn't reach $1 billion until 2015. I used to say that, and I won't name the oil company, but I said they spill more oil in a year than the value of lithium. And that was obviously an exaggeration for effect, but go back and look at it. $1 billion market is a tiny market. And we didn't get there until 2015. It took 7 decades for the lithium market to become 1 million tons of lithium carbonate. How many tons of iron ore? sell in a year? How many tons of oil sell if you frame it as tons? You read books about Mark Rich or somebody like that, you can frame all these numbers. Lithium still has a long way. It's just getting started.
Okay. Your advice to lithium shareholders, hear from a lot of people worried, oh, my exposure, the market is not going anywhere. I said, oh no, but even I have some holding as well, saying electric car is the start, the home batteries and batteries everywhere is where lithium is going to go.
Yeah. It's very interesting for me because people want everything to be easy. And especially with Australian investors who love to put, I will still say lithium is not a commodity. It's a specialty chemical, but it has commodity characteristics, especially with what Australia produces. Everybody jumped on the bandwagon. Everybody wanted in 2016, 2017, 2018. I started getting paid well to go to Sydney, Melbourne, and present to potential investors. At that point in time, the EV market was tiny, but it was a belief. Now we have an EV market that's booming, and all the lithium investors are going back to uranium or gold because we had a bubble in 2022. The lithium price went to 80,000 on the spot market in China. Everybody that got in late thought that's the way it should be. It never should have happened. That was an anomaly that unfortunately may happen again with a boom and bust cycle. But the lithium price today, everybody complains about how low it is. It's still higher than most of my career. Most of my career, the price of lithium chemicals that would go into a battery were less than $6,000 a ton. Right now, they're 10,000 a ton. It's just everybody has this high watermark from the bubble of 2022. Now is actually the time to be buying lithium stocks because they've been so beaten down. Albemarle, I think in the last 2 years is down over 70%, the biggest lithium player in the world. Most of the Aussie stocks have been battered. And anything else, you have to take a long-term view. And the people that complain the loudest are the guys who got in late and got burned. And that's the way it always.
And don't have the patience to hang on.
But it's greed kills. And every lithium stock I have is still green because I bought at the right time. I've lost literally millions of dollars on paper, but my investments are still positive because I bought at the right time. And now's the time to buy again, in my opinion. I don't give investing advice on my podcast, and I don't give it here. I just say when I do.
I was curious about personal branding you have. I had dinner with a junior colleague yesterday. I was saying the way the AI is coming or already here and the future of it, AI would be able to do everything, but authenticity will be key, right? AI can produce the best LinkedIn photo. That's not your photo, right? So how do you link the influx of social media content that's happening or will happen because of AI and people like yourself with an authentic voice, with a long journey and the depth of experience coming to the social media space? How do you see all these things working together in a world where anything and everything can be produced synthetically without actually doing anything?
I think that's one of the biggest difficulties that we face. My older daughter writes books. My younger daughter produced music videos and films and written scripts that have been sold to major studios. This is a major problem for them as they go through their career because they're just really getting started. They're both in their young 30s. For me, I don't care because I have a core audience. I'm pretty well convinced that what I do is too small to attract too much AI. And I think right now I spend a fair amount of time just testing AI and asking it questions, and it's still not very good in what I do. It still gives a lot of wrong answers, but I see stuff online all the time that I know is fake. And the problem is that my granddaughter's 9 months old, and she's going to grow up in a world where it's like currency. How do you put the proof of the currency so the counterfeiters can't duplicate it? I don't have an answer to that. I'm not enough of an expert in that field. But for my personal brand, I'm not worried. I've had copycats. I've had people clone my Twitter account many, many times. And what ultimately happens is the first thing they do is block me so I can't see what they do. But immediately people say, we know that wasn't you. And they report it to Twitter or X and they take it down or whatever. And that's a small thing, but it's a real concern. And I think it's going to be interesting how it's managed, because I think we may get to the point where you can't believe anything on social media.
I think that's what I was joking, that in not too distant future, all deals has to be signed face to face, though the air travel will increase because people like to hear the voice, see the voice, shake the hand.
And that's what I always loved about Asia. Even if I can go back to the 90s, and I had customers who were buying literally millions of dollars of lithium from me that said, I only need to see you once a year when we negotiate the contract. You don't need to come and see me. And then I moved to Japan, and it's a high touch culture. South America is a high touch culture that people want to see your face. They want to have dinner with you, and they don't want it to be a 45-minute dinner. They want it to be a 3-hour dinner. They want to know about you. They want to know about your family. And that's what I loved about Asia. It was really like family. The most people I ever hired was when I was living in China. My commitment to them was that it wasn't going to be like an American company. It was going to be like a family, and hopefully not a dysfunctional family. I use other countries that the company I work for operated in and say, that's the model, not the American.
Yeah, because the things that trust can solve, a dozen of lawyers on both sides can't.
Let me give you an example from lithium.
Please.
When Tesla had the Model S and they were projecting demand, Panasonic was their big battery supplier. The Japanese trading company that was supplying not just lithium, but other battery metals and other things for the battery to Panasonic, came to me with a huge number at the time for lithium and said, I need this much. And I said, that's 65% of our capacity. And if you think I'm going to accept a purchase order that doesn't have take or pay in it, you are out of your mind, because people like me get fired for doing stupid commercial deals. And so I not only had a large premium to the market price because I was the only qualified supplier, I had a take or pay. And in the pricing part of that agreement, it said I was going to adjust price quarterly. And in the absence of agreement, they could turn me down. If I said it's going up 5% this quarter, there wasn't an index, there weren't pricing models, there wasn't a forward market. It was price is what I say it is. And if you don't agree, you can not buy with a notice period, but it was all done on trust. And they literally signed that agreement because I'd been doing business with them for so long. What I told them was, I will never enforce this. If I can move the product elsewhere, you're not going to, the take or pay was going to be based on basically they were going to have to insure my lost profit. It wasn't going to be, I'm going to hold the hammer over your head. And I could not believe they signed that agreement because it was so one-sided, based on trust. And then the company I work for got a new CEO. He came to Asia and he talked to one of my customers, and they said, we don't buy from the name of the company. We buy from Josan. And I got called in and told I'd done a terrible job because the customers were loyal to me and not to the company. And I said, what you don't understand about Asia is to them, I am the company. It's the relationship. You're just a guy who comes through once a year, shakes a few hands and goes. I'm the consistency. And that was the beginning of the end for me at that company, because I had engendered loyalty to myself, which to me was what you did in Asia. I represented the company. And it was probably the best example of the cultural divide between East and West that I could point out. I was never trying to sell myself. I was never trying to get personal gain. I was trying to engender trust, but the trust was personal.
Yes, this is a very interesting point that you make. Isn't that where world is headed now because of AI? Because that high tech, high touch, no, that Japan brought into the table. Maybe this is the time again, right? People with the sea of content, you are looking for the faces. Like you go to a football, suddenly you saw even your distant neighbor who never speak. That is the one person you know in this sea of strangers. This personal touch has to be a big thing in coming days because we have too many touches.
I think we're making the same point in a different way, but I do think at the end of the day, business always has a personal element. And if it doesn't, it's a very boring world.
So tell me a little bit about your book. I'm quite excited. So when it's coming, what are you talking about?
My younger daughter is in production. So I'm basically telling her she's got to produce the book, which means she needs to ride herd on me. I had started this a couple of years ago and then got busy and then decided at the beginning of the year that I was going to make this a commitment to get done by the end of the year. I was writing today. And honestly, for me, this book is a personal book. If other people want to come along for the ride, that's great. But I'm not writing the book to make money. I'm writing the book to tell a story. And it's my story in the lithium industry. Because I came up at the right time and because I was literally at the beginning as lithium ion was growing, I know the guy who started CATL. I know the people that started BYD. I know the guys who started the Chinese lithium companies. I've spoken at their events. I'll have young people say, I'd like to do what you do. And I said, you can't, because we can't start over. You can have a great career in this industry, but I was at the right place at the right time. That wasn't because I was smart. It's just because sometimes circumstances work out to your benefit.
I like the definition of being lucky. When preparedness meets an opportunity, you're prepared, opportunity came, that's it.
Yeah. I had to rely on people much smarter than myself throughout my whole career. But that's a skill too. It's a skill to know what you don't know. And there's a lot I don't know. So I had a lot of opportunity to practice that skill.
Thank you so much. Do you want to highlight anything before we close up? I really learned a lot.
No, if your listeners are interested in the lithium industry, I have a podcast. It's called the Global Lithium Podcast. You can get it on Apple, Spotify, Google, all the major platforms. It's not just lithium, but it's batteries and everything that's in that ecosystem. If you want to listen, and if you're on X, I'm at Global Lithium, and I publish on LinkedIn, and my website's globallithium.net.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Energypreneurs. To continue listening to this conversation, please visit us at Energypreneurs. Thank you. See you next time.